The Chicago underworld knew Cesare Conti as a monster who swore he would never leave an heir. Blood was a weakness. But that rule died the night a soft-spoken, plus-size baker stepped over a bleeding hitman to ask the Don for a single favor to save her little boy. The Chicago winter was unforgiving, but it had nothing on Cesare Conti. As the head of the Conti syndicate, Cesare ruled the city from the glittering high-rises of the Loop down to the grit of the shipping yards. He was 34, cut from ruthless Italian marble, and governed by a single, unbreakable law. No wives, and absolutely no heirs. Cesare had learned the hard way that family was a vulnerability. He had watched his own father bleed out on a warehouse floor, betrayed by a rival who had used his mother as bait. On that day, Cesare buried his heart alongside his parents. He built an empire on fear, logic, and isolation. His men respected him because he had nothing to lose. He could not be extorted. He could not be blackmailed. He was an island of violence, and the syndicate thrived under his cold, calculating reign. But power always breeds envy. Clive Falcone, a vicious upstart commanding a fractured but dangerous coalition in the South Side, had been testing the borders of Conti territory. Clive was a vulture, feeding on the weak, extorting small businesses, and leaving a trail of broken neighborhoods in his wake. Cesare had been biding his time, gathering intelligence, preparing to wipe the Falcone name from the map in one swift surgical strike. He never expected a woman from the near West Side to walk into his crosshairs and change the trajectory of his entire life. Noemi Bellini lived in a world of powdered sugar, early mornings, and quiet survival. At 28, she was a single mother to a 5-year-old boy named Leo and the proud owner of a struggling bakery called the Sugar Dust. Noemi was a woman of soft, generous curves with a gentle smile that hid a lifetime of quiet resilience. She embraced her plus-size figure with a quiet, unbothered dignity, dressing in wrap dresses that moved gracefully as she worked the ovens. But beneath her sweet exterior lay a spine of pure steel. Noemi was the daughter of an old-school numbers runner who had worked the fringes of the mob decades ago. Her father had died, leaving her nothing but a mountain of debts and a strict education in how the underworld operated. She knew how to keep her head down, how to read a room, and most importantly, how to spot a predator. Predators came to her bakery on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. 3 of Clive Falcone's enforcers kicked open the door of the Sugar Dust, shattering the glass chimes hanging above the register. The smell of fresh vanilla and yeast was immediately tainted by the stench of cheap cologne and malice. Noemi pushed little Leo behind the counter, her maternal instincts flaring into overdrive. The lead thug, a bruised-looking man with a scarred lip, slammed a baseball bat onto the pastry display, shattering the glass. He informed Noemi that her neighborhood was under new management. Clive Falcone required a protection fee, a sum so astronomical that it would bankrupt her in a month. When Noemi calmly stated she did not have the money, the thug reached over the counter, grabbing a handful of her apron, and yanked her forward. He whispered that if she did not pay by Friday, they would take it out on the boy hiding by her knees. They expected her to weep. They expected her to beg. Instead, Noemi stared directly into the man's eyes, her pulse roaring in her ears, but her face completely still. She did not flinch. She simply memorized his face, brushed his hand off her apron, and told him she would handle it. The thugs laughed, tossing a chair through her front window before leaving her in the freezing draft. Noemi swept up the glass, locked the door, and held her trembling son. She knew exactly what would happen. If she paid Clive Falcone, he would bleed her dry and eventually kill her anyway. Going to the police was a death sentence. There was only one way to neutralize a dog like Clive Falcone. You had to go to the wolf. That evening, Nomi left Leo with her trusted elderly neighbor. She washed the flour from her hands, put on her best emerald green dress that hugged her full hips and accentuated her soft shoulders, and layered a heavy wool coat over it. She took a deep breath, gathered a small velvet pouch from her floorboards, and walked out into the freezing Chicago night. Her destination was the Obsidian Club, the impenetrable fortress and front for the Conti Syndicate. It was an exclusive, high-end casino and lounge where politicians rubbed elbows with assassins. Getting inside was supposed to be impossible for a baker from the near West Side. But Noemi possessed a hidden strength, a photographic memory, and a sharp, analytical mind her father had trained since she was a child. She walked up to the towering bouncers at the VIP entrance. When they blocked her path, she did not stutter. She calmly recited an old, obscure syndicate debt code, a ledger number her father had memorized 20 years ago, and stated she was there to pay a blood debt directly to Cesare Conti. The bouncers were confused enough to call it in. To her surprise, and perhaps to the surprise of the entire club, the word came down from the penthouse. Let her up. The elevator doors opened to a sprawling penthouse suite that looked out over the glittering skyline of Chicago. The room was dark, furnished in leather and mahogany, smelling of expensive bourbon and fine cigar smoke. Cesare Conti sat behind a massive desk, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He looked like a dark god carved from shadows, his sharp jawline and piercing dark eyes evaluating every millimeter of the woman who had just stepped off his elevator. Cesare had expected a sniveling, desperate old associate. Instead, he saw Noemi. She stood before him, the emerald dress hugging her lush curves, her chin tilted upward in defiance. The freezing wind had flushed her cheeks, and a few strands of dark hair had escaped her bun. In a world full of sharp edges and hollow, starving women vying for his attention, Noemi was soft, vibrant, and incredibly real. But what struck Cesare the hardest was not her undeniable beauty. It was her eyes. There was no terror in them. There was only a burning, protective resolve. Cesare leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. He told her she had 3 minutes to explain why she was wasting his time before he had her thrown off the balcony. Noemi did not tremble. She walked right up to his desk, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and placed a small velvet pouch on his desk. She introduced herself, told him about her father, and then laid out her proposition. She explained that Clive Falcone's men had threatened her 5-year-old son, and she needed a favor. She needed the Conti Syndicate to place the sugar dust under absolute protection. Cesare let out a dark, humorless laugh. He asked her why the Dawn of Chicago would lift a single finger to protect a bakery and a child that meant absolutely nothing to him. He reminded her that he was not a charity, and he certainly was not a savior. Nomi held his gaze. She told him she knew he wasn't a savior, but she also knew he was a businessman preparing for a war. She reached into the velvet pouch and pulled out an encrypted flash drive. Her father might have been a low-level runner, but he had been a paranoid one. Before he died, he had stumbled upon a hidden ledger detailing Clive Falcone's offshore accounts, shell companies, and the exact coordinates of his weapon shipments. Her father had hidden the drive, but Nomi had memorized the password. She offered Cesare the one thing he needed to dismantle Clive Falcone's empire overnight. All for a single favor: keep the monsters away from her little boy. Cesare stared at the drive, and then his eyes slowly traveled back up to Noemi's face. The sheer audacity of this lush, beautiful woman walking into his fortress and demanding a trade left him entirely captivated. His mind, usually a cold engine of logic, suddenly felt flooded with a strange possessive heat. He realized he didn't just want the drive. He wanted to see how deep her resilience went. He stood up, walking around the desk. He towered over her, his presence suffocating and dangerous. But Noemi held her ground, looking up at him with unyielding brown eyes. Cesare reached out, tracing a single, calloused knuckle down the soft curve of her cheek. He felt her breath hitch, but she did not pull away. He told her the deal was accepted. Falcone's men would never set foot in her bakery again. But he altered the terms. He told her that protection meant she belonged to the Conti syndicate now. She was under his jurisdiction, and he would be keeping a very, very close eye on his new investment. The favor was granted, and the obsession began. The very next morning, the bruised enforcer who had threatened Noemi was found beaten half to death and left hanging by his ankles outside one of Falcone's warehouses, a box of powdered sugar dumped over his head. The message was clear to the underworld. The sugar dust was Conti territory, but Cesare could not stay away. What started as a strategic maneuver quickly spiraled into a dark, all-consuming fascination. The ruthless Mafia Boss, a man who swore he would never care for another soul, began altering his daily routes just to visit a tiny bakery on the near west side. He would arrive in a fleet of black SUVs, his men securing the perimeter while he walked inside, ignoring the terrified whispers of the neighborhood. He would sit at a small corner table, drinking black coffee and watching Noemi work. He was mesmerized by her. He loved the way she moved, the capable strength in her hands as she kneaded dough, the gentle way she handled her customers, and the fierce, unconditional love she showered on her son, Leo. At first, Noemi tried to keep things professional, treating him like a dangerous client. But Cesare stripped away her defenses piece by piece. He was terrifying to the world, but with her, he was intensely protective. He brought Leo rare comic books and sat patiently while the 5-year-old explained the plots to him. Cesare's own men watched in stunned silence as the most dangerous man in Chicago let a child smear chocolate on his designer suit. Noemi found herself looking forward to the chime of the door. Beneath Cesare's lethal exterior, she saw a man who had been starved of warmth for his entire life. The chemistry between them became a physical weight in the room. When he brushed past her in the narrow kitchen, his hand lingering on the curve of her waist, a spark of dark, forbidden romance ignited between them. He made her feel beautiful, cherished, and incredibly safe. But safety is an illusion in the Mafia. Clive Falcone was enraged. The loss of his enforcer and the sudden dismantling of his offshore accounts sent him into a paranoid frenzy. He realized Cesare Conti had found a weakness. The untouchable Don was suddenly spending his afternoons sipping coffee in a dilapidated neighborhood, watching a plus-size baker with obsessive devotion. Clive saw his opening. 3 weeks after the deal was made, Noemi was closing the shop late. Leo was asleep in the back office. The streets were unnervingly quiet. Suddenly, the roar of an engine shattered the silence. A black sedan jumped the curb, and a barrage of bullets tore through the front of the sugar dust. Noemi threw herself over Leo in the back room as glass and plaster rained down around them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her hand clamped over her son's mouth to keep him quiet. The shooting stopped, followed by the screech of tires speeding away. Within minutes, Cesare arrived. He did not look like the composed businessman who drank coffee in her corner. He looked like the devil himself. He found Noemi shaking in the back room, clutching Leo to her chest. When Cesare saw the blood on her arm from a grazing piece of shrapnel, something inside him snapped permanently. He dropped to his knees, pulling Noemi and Leo into his massive arms. He pressed his face into her hair, inhaling the scent of vanilla and gunpowder. The rule he had lived by his entire life shattered into 1,000,000 pieces on the bakery floor. He didn't just want to protect her as an asset. She was his. Leo was his. Cesare looked at his underboss over Noemi's shoulder, his eyes pitch black with lethal intent. He ordered his men to pack her things. They were never coming back to this apartment. Noemi and Leo were moving into his penthouse, behind bulletproof glass and an army of guards. As Cesare carried a sleeping Leo out to the armored SUV, his other hand gripping Noemi's tightly, he swore a silent oath to the Chicago skyline. He was going to burn Clive Falcone alive. The ruthless boss who said no heirs was taking his family home. The penthouse atop the Conti Tower was a fortress suspended in the clouds, a sanctuary of bulletproof glass, steel, and cold Italian marble. For Cesare Conti, it had always been a solitary watchtower. But within 48 hours of Noemi Bellini and her son arriving, the sterile luxury was transformed. The scent of expensive bourbon and gun oil was replaced by the aroma of rising dough, melted butter, and vanilla. Noemi refused to be treated like a fragile captive, even if she was flanked by heavily armed guards every time she walked down the hallway. She needed normalcy for Leo, so she commandeered the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen. She baked pastries, bread, and cakes, feeding the stern-faced syndicate's enforcers who guarded their doors. The hardened killers of the Chicago underworld quickly realized that the Don's new obsession was not just a beautiful woman. She was the heart the syndicate never knew it needed. Cesare, however, was a man standing on the edge of a precipice. The drive Noemi had given him was a gold mine. Using the ledger data, Cesare systematically dismantled Clive Falcone's operation. He froze Clive's offshore accounts through illicit bank contacts, intercepted his weapon shipments at the naval pier, and burned 3 of his counterfeit warehouses to the ground. The streets of the South Side were running red, and Cesare was orchestrating the slaughter with the cold precision of a maestro. Yet the moment Cesare stepped off the private elevator into his penthouse, the ruthless Don vanished. He would strip off his blood-spattered suit jacket, wash his hands with obsessive care, and walk into the kitchen. He would stand in the doorway, simply watching Noemi. He was entirely captivated by her. In a world of sharp, starving socialites and calculating mafia princesses, Noemi was an oasis of warmth. He loved the generous, lush curves of her body, the soft swell of her hips, and the way her dark hair cascaded over her full shoulders. He worshipped her resilience. She had looked a cartel of killers in the eye and walked away without blinking. One evening, after Leo had been tucked into bed in a room filled with toys Cesare had bought for him, the tension between Noemi and Cesare finally snapped. Noemi was wiping down the granite countertops when Cesare approached her from behind. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, exhaling a long, exhausted breath. Noemi turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She felt the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion in his dark eyes. She didn't see the monster the city feared. She saw a man who was carrying the weight of an empire to keep her safe. Cesare traced the curve of her jaw, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. He confessed that he had spent his entire life building walls, swearing he would never let a woman or a child become his weakness. He told her that he was terrified, not of Falcone, but of the fact that if anything ever happened to her or Leo, there would not be enough of Chicago left standing to satisfy his wrath. Noemi looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce and unwavering. She told him he was not weak. She reminded him that her father had taught her the underworld operated on leverage, and while love was leverage, it was also the ultimate armor. She stepped into him, closing the distance, and kissed him. It was a kiss that sealed their fates. Cesare responded with a consuming, desperate hunger, lifting her effortlessly onto the kitchen island. He kissed her as if she were oxygen in a suffocating room. He worshipped every inch of her plus-size figure, his hands mapping the soft, beautiful curves she had sometimes felt self-conscious about in her past, but under Cesare's burning gaze, she felt like a goddess. That night, the ruthless Mafia Boss laid his empire at the feet of a baker, vowing that she would be his queen, and the boy sleeping down the hall would be his heir. But out in the freezing darkness of the city, a wounded animal was preparing to strike. Clive Falcone was bankrupt, desperate, and humiliated. The loss of his territory had caused his remaining captains to lose faith in him. He knew that to reclaim his power, he had to cut the head off the snake. But Cesare Conti was untouchable, moving in heavily armored convoys and surrounded by elite guards. Clive knew he could not beat Cesare in a straight fight. He needed to hit the one thing Cesare had inexplicably exposed to the world: his new family. Clive spent his last remaining dollars purchasing the loyalty of a corrupt technician who serviced the private power grid of the Conti Tower. If he could not reach Cesare on the streets, he would bring the war to the sky. It happened on a Friday night, during the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in a decade. The howling wind battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Cesare was standing in his study, reviewing the final locations of Clive's remaining safe-houses, preparing to end the war by morning. Nomi was reading a story to Leo in the living room, the fireplace casting a warm, flickering glow over them. Without warning, the penthouse plunged into absolute darkness. The ambient hum of the central heating and the security servers died instantly. Cesare's survival instincts engaged before his conscious mind did. He drew his sidearm and burst into the living room, his voice cutting through the dark, ordering Noemi to get down. The emergency backup generators, which should have kicked in immediately, remained dead. This was not a storm outage. This was a deliberate, catastrophic breach. Downstairs, the radio chatter from the ground floor lobby erupted into static, followed by the terrifying sound of sustained automatic gunfire. Clive Falcone had brought a small army of mercenaries into the building, using the blizzard as cover and the blackout to bypass the electronic checkpoints. They were climbing the emergency stairwells, heavily armed and wearing night vision gear, intending to slaughter everyone on the top floor. Cesare quickly ushered Noemi and Leo into the reinforced panic room, located behind the library's false wall. It was a titanium-lined bunker with independent air filtration and an analog communication array. He knelt in front of Nomi, pressing a loaded pistol into her trembling hands. He told her to lock the door and not to open it for anyone but him. But Noemi grabbed his wrist before he could pull away. Her analytical mind, forged by years of survival and pattern recognition, raced through the blueprints of the building she had studied when Cesare first brought her here. She told Cesare that the panic room was secure, but if Clive's men breached the penthouse, they would use thermal explosives to blow the door. She refused to sit blindly in a box while the man she loved fought alone in the dark. She pointed to the analog surveillance hub inside the panic room. The internal cameras operated on a closed-circuit battery system that the blackout could not disable. She told Cesare she would be his eyes. She would guide him through the earpiece. Cesare looked at the woman he loved, seeing the absolute steel in her spine. He kissed her hard, a promise of violence and return, and locked her and Leo inside the bunker. Cesare slipped into the pitch-black hallways of his penthouse, a shadow moving among shadows. In his earpiece, Noemi's voice was steady and calm, contrasting the roaring storm outside. She called out grid coordinates. 3 men in the west corridor, 2 breaching the kitchen. Cesare moved with terrifying efficiency. He was a phantom of death. When Noemi warned him of a flank in the dining room, Cesare dropped into the darkness, slicing the legs out from under a mercenary, before executing him silently. He moved through his home, systematically hunting the invaders. The mercenaries, expecting a panicked billionaire, instead found the devil himself waiting in the dark. But Clive Falcone was not a mercenary. He was a coward who used others as shields. While his men died in the corridors, Clive slipped through the master bedroom, locating the structural seams of the library walls. He planted a localized breach charge on the outer wall of the panic room. The explosion rocked the penthouse, blowing a massive hole in the plaster and revealing the reinforced titanium door. The blast disabled the internal cameras. In Cesare's earpiece, Noemi's voice cut out, replaced by deafening static. Cold, absolute terror seized Cesare's heart. He abandoned stealth, sprinting through the smoke-filled hallways, gunning down the last 2 mercenaries in his path. He burst into the library, just as Clive Falcone was placing a thermite charge directly onto the panic room's electronic locking mechanism. Cesare did not hesitate. He fired, putting a bullet straight through Clive's shoulder. The impact spun the villain around, the thermite charge dropping harmlessly to the floor. Clive collapsed against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm, his face twisted in a snarl of agony and hatred. He spat blood onto the floor, laughing breathlessly, telling Cesare that the great Don had gone soft, that he had traded his invincible armor for a fat baker and a bastard child. Cesare walked slowly across the room. He did not speak. He did not offer a grand, villainous monologue. He simply grabbed Clive by the throat, lifted him off his feet, and slammed him against the shattered wall. Cesare's eyes were devoid of humanity. He squeezed, crushing the windpipe of the man who had dared to threaten his family. Clive's eyes bulged in terror as the life was choked out of him, his legs kicking uselessly until he finally went limp. Cesare dropped the lifeless body to the floor like discarded trash. Breathing heavily, Cesare turned to the titanium door. He tapped the secret code on the analog keypad. The heavy bolts disengaged, and the door swung open. Noemi was standing there, shielding Leo behind her body, the pistol raised and aimed perfectly at chest height. When she saw Cesare, the gun lowered. She didn't collapse or cry. She walked forward and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face in his chest. Cesare dropped his weapon, holding her with a crushing, desperate grip, burying his face in her hair. He pulled Leo into the embrace, kneeling in the wreckage of his library, holding his family as the storm raged outside. In the aftermath of the siege, the Chicago underworld shifted on its axis. The Falcone syndicate was utterly annihilated, its remnants absorbed or destroyed by Contian forces. The message was permanently burned into the minds of every criminal, politician, and rival boss in the country. Cesare Conti was no longer a solitary island, and his family was untouchable. 6 months later, under the warm summer sun, the gardens of the Conti estate were in full bloom. Cesare stood at the end of an aisle lined with white roses, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He watched as Noemi walked toward him, looking breathtaking in a custom-designed lace gown that celebrated every lush, gorgeous curve of her figure. Beside him stood Leo, wearing a miniature matching tuxedo, holding the rings with immense pride. As Noemi reached the altar, Cesare took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. He looked into the eyes of the sweet, plus-size, single mother who had bravely walked into his fortress and demanded a favor, irrevocably altering his destiny. The ruthless Mafia Boss, who had once sworn to the heavens that he would never take a wife and never leave an heir, kissed his bride, securing his legacy and finally finding his home. Did this intense Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? The Chicago underworld is full of dark secrets. But nothing is more powerful than a fiercely protective Don claiming the woman he loves. If you want more gripping, high-stakes romance stories filled with unexpected twists and undeniable passion, hit that like button right now. Leave a comment telling us your favorite part of Noemi and Cesare's journey. Share this video with your fellow romance readers, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales.